here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week, it's the turn of the writer and author Richard Langston, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry, and all the other groovy stuff, has just written another book, this one on another New Zealand band, The Clean. It's titled In the Dreamlife, You Need a Rubber Soul, which has just come out April 2026, available from all good bookshops and also online. So this is me talking to Richard about this publication and a bit about his own musical journey in life, starting with those early formative years. Richard, it's over to you.
Well, Bowie was certainly there. I think for our generation, he was. He was at the centre of so much. Glam, certainly T-Rex. That kind of stuff was, certainly it started us down the path. I mean, and the Sex Pistols were huge here in terms of the influence they would have, or punk would have, on a lot of the bands that ended up recording on Flying Nun. Certainly the first echelon of bands that came out of Dunedin, The Enemy and The Clean,
yes,
were very inspired by the Sex Pistols, not to imitate them, but to carry that kind of energy into their music. Certainly The Clean had so many ideas anyway, because I'd listened to so much 60s music, like all of us. The radio here, was filled with the Kinks, the Beatles, etc. So you got a strong idea of pop.
yes.
And then the Kilgour brothers, who were really the start of The Clean, they had very adventurous music tastes from the outset. They were way beyond what most of us were listening to. They were searching out records by, weird and obscure West Coast psychedelia bands, So,
Right.
So they had an appetite, which is it's kind of strange to think. They kind of grew up in the country on farms, but once they hit the city, they were just culture vultures. They absorbed everything.
Yes.
A fascinating story, really, coming from the farm boys fell in love with music, art, and, it carried them around the world and over the 40 years or so that they existed. So
Yes. And what were their parents like then? Were they?
they were farming people. Their mum, was a pretty conservative farmer, but she had this really strong artistic streak too. She loved singing, she loved drawing and painting, and that was passed on to the boys from the outset. So they were creative from very early on. That was what they did.
And they didn't have any other siblings then. They just were
No. Hamish and David. Hamish was the elder. He was the oldest. He was 4 years older than David, so he was a huge influence on David as well. As Hamish grew up, he absorbed a lot of literature. He did it. Studied at university. He loved the Beats, Ginsberg, Kerouac. They were huge in his mind, and Dylan. You led to Dylan through Kerouac and the Ginsberg. So, and he passed a lot of that on to David. So Hamish was, Hamish wrote probably their most well-known lyric, "Anything Could Happen," and that was very Dylan influenced, and the sound of it's kind of Rolling Stone-ish. I mean, they were big Rolling Stones fans too.
Right. So they had all that going on as well.
Yeah, they had that all going on. That's why they didn't start. They were never really a punk band in the sense of what we think of an English type punk band, or they were kind of more. If they modelled themselves stylistically on what they wore, it was probably more the Ramones.
Right. Yes, American punk than British punk. But then, yeah. So when did they move out of the countryside and into the city? When they
Yeah, when they were teenagers. So David was, I think, about 12, and Hamish was about 16. They ended up at this very conservative boys' school, Otago Boys High School in Dunedin, which was a very kind of repressive school of that era. They all were. My high school was the same, run
Right.
by Second World War veterans. So there was plenty to kick against. And Dunedin, as a city where the Kilgours moved to in 1972 when they were teenagers, it was a conservative Presbyterian Scots settled city. So there was, I mean, the university was established there. So the Scots settlers were aiming, to create a kind of new Scottish society in Dunedin, and they had lots of good ideas, lots of great things that they handed on, which was, the need for an education, university.
Yes.
So they had those kind of aspirations, religious as well, and so the Kilgours kind of, as your teenagers, you kick against what's been placed in front of you, and they
What
did
was the
that.
what was the sort of the economy like during the sort of early 70s in New Zealand? Because in Britain, obviously we were sort of going through quite a lot of strikes and strife, and eventually the 3-day week, endless kind of yes, it was, the unions were sort of powerful. It was quite a lot of
Yeah.
I remember Ted Heath doing that famous Christmas speech where he just said, "I'm sorry, but we're going to have to miss Christmas this year and tighten your belts," and things that you wouldn't do
Yeah,
now.
I
You would
remember.
just lie to your
Yeah,
public, wouldn't you? You wouldn't tell them the truth because but
yeah,
yeah, so
yeah.
what was it like in New Zealand? And
It was a time of economic difficulties. We had the oil shocks of 1973, so it carried through. Um, it was not a prosperous time, and actually, it was. I think my generation was more shaped by what happened in the early 80s, which was, I mean, it was always vaguely, deeply conservative government. So, farmer Tory sort of governments really we had, except for we had a Labor government in '74. Norman
right,
Kirk, he was very much pro-worker, and that government was looked upon fondly by working people, certainly. But once Robert Muldoon was our prime minister again, I think '75. And he was old school conservative, a bit of a bloody tyrant, really. He ruled his cabinet and ruled the country. Told us all about how brilliant he was because he was an accountant at economics, and he turned out to be an absolute disaster. His legacy was appalling. He stopped our pension fund basically, and it cost us billions of dollars over the 40 years. Since he was not good. But the thing that probably shaped us more was 1981, the Springbok tour.
right.
The Springbok rugby team came here, and that really split the country in half, literally. It was, arguments within families because obviously the younger generation were anti-apartheid. So the Springboks come here. I mean, this happened in Australia, happened in England too, but happened here probably because rugby's such a religion here. It had a huge impact on the country. It just changed the way we saw ourselves. We understood that we had racism, had violence. It was en masse. So that was, so that was a big thing that post-punk, bands, the clean, that carried that sense of kicking against the pricks,
Yes.
in the biblical sense of, that phrase. So that was a big. I think that David was. If the '70s led to something, it probably led to that moment. If dissatisfaction in the '70s suddenly exploded, it was probably around that Springbok tour.
Yes, God, it's
It
amazing.
was
We had,
amazing.
yeah, when you mentioned that, I remember there was a lot of kind of annoyance about Zola Budd suddenly being sort of eligible to run for the the
Mm,
UK athletics, and her fast track, and then it all goes terribly
yeah,
wrong, and the
yeah, yeah,
corruption, because obviously Thatcher thought this was just good business. We don't care about
yeah.
ethics, and
Oh, well, her son went to South Africa. He did business there. I mean,
yes.
there was just a lack of morality.
I
Full
know
stop.
it's terrible. But then going back to, so what was the music scene then in the sort of early to mid 70s in New Zealand? Was there a sort of a healthy scene developing at that point?
Well, there was, but there were bad. We had split ends who were, um, they really cut a path in New Zealand because suddenly you had people with Hamish Kilgour talks about the influence of split ends on his thinking. If the music didn't impact on them, their style and the way they dressed and carried themselves, which was crazy haircuts, very colourful clothing, etc.
Yes.
And they walked around and in this in their garb, and so that kind of established an idea that you could be individual in this country despite people trying to push you down and make you conform. Uh, yeah. But the music in the local scene in Dunedin was really pub bands doing
Right.
covers. That was what was expected. But then, that's why punk was important because it allowed people who weren't necessarily musos and musicians, but had lots of ideas, bands like Swell Maps and the Slits and so
Oh
forth. They
yes.
were very much being simpatico with the clean, whereby you might not have been musically proficient, but you had really good ideas, and
Yes.
what you do will last. So the Clean had that idea from the outset. They had more ideas than actual musical ability, but that's what you need. And
That's what you need. That's a good combination, isn't it, really? Youthful
yeah,
enthusiasm and sometimes
yeah,
naivety. But yes,
yeah.
arrogance thrown in, which you kind of, you lose as you get older, but it's very important at the time, isn't it, really? So then, when did they decide music was going to be their path in life? When did a musical instrument, the drums and guitars, suddenly appear in their orbit?
Very early. So David was 17, I think, or maybe 16. Yeah, he was still at school because there's a story in the book, of David taking a guitar to Chris Knox, who was kind of, a bit of a punk godfather in Dunedin and would go on to form after the Enemy. His first band would form Tall Dwarfs and have a solo career. And he's a legend in New Zealand music circles. Sorry, what was it? What was that
Oh,
again, David?
oh, what's God, I can. Yes, a good question there. The music
Oh,
scene.
yeah, sorry. When guitars and drums first came into life,
Yes,
very early, and then Hamish bought a set of drums. He learned to drum to Mo Tucker beat in What Goes On, the Velvet
right.
Underground. That's how he learned to drum. He thought, I could do that. So that's how he started. And David kind of had this just innate ability on the guitar, and he quickly flourished in Dunedin. He learned from Alec, his great mate Alec Bathgate, who again was in the Tall Dwarf, he was in the Enemy at the time, and the Enemy were a huge influence on the Clean, and that they were the first to get up and play, and they sort of set a template. As someone as a music critic and important figure in the scene, Roy Colbert said, they had Stooges bottoms and Beatles tops. That they combined the fury of the Stooges with the melodicism of the Beatles, and so
Right.
that was always a factor. The '60s always fed into that punk ethos. So that's kind of what they were aiming for, a classical pop songs in a way, but also a lot of noise
Yes,
and
and obviously it started
energy.
to develop as sort of a scene because I did notice
Yes,
that there was a lot of
yeah, that's
that
really
kind of
important.
community.
That's really important, David. I hadn't, because people love to create myths, and I'm all for myths too, but really, if you look at, because people say, how did all that music come out of Dunedin? Because a lot did come out of Dunedin and ended up on the Flying Nun label and travelled around the world and was influential. Well, it was really quite simple. Chris Knox moved from the most southern city in Invercargill to Dunedin, the university town. He went to university there. And Chris was always looking for a stage. He was this colourful guy with tons of ideas. He was into film, making his own films. He was into sound. He was, very creatively minded. He moved to Dunedin in 71, sorry. The Kilgour family came to Dunedin in 72. And then Alec Bathgate, the guitarist for The Enemy, came off the farm in 1976 to go to Dunedin. And these figures are, they're pivotal to what would happen, and they became friends. And then, then a sort of wider knot of people coalesced around them. So you suddenly had people who were validating each other. Yes, this is a legitimate thing to do. We can write songs, we can record them, which they all did. The Clean recorded themselves from very early on, and we can make something of this. Because at that point, making a record was not really in anyone's orbit.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like Britain or England where bands recorded, like Step Forward with The Fall. All those small indie labels started. We had two labels by the late 70s, early 80s. Propeller and
Right.
Ripper Records, but they were in Auckland. That's a miles away from from Dunedin. They were very isolated, So no, and that's when Flying Nun started in 1981. So that's when people actually started to go. Well, Flying Nun was started by Roger Shepherd specifically to put out records by the Clean. He saw them in Christchurch in 1981 and just went, this band is world beating. We've got to record them. And he started his record label 2 weeks after seeing them. He registered the record label Flying Nun.
That's fantastic, isn't it? I think Cooking Vinyl started with Michelle Schock. I think that was one of her, I don't know, I think he found the tape, was it Campfire Tape or something,
Yeah.
and started
Yeah.
the label. I might be wrong, but it's kind of, that's in my mind. But it's nice to think that they got that enthusiasm.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about communities and what influence, a handful of strong, creative people can have. Because I read John Lydon's book recently on the Sex Pistols and how that scene happened. It's very similar to what happened in Dunedin. It's just that because the Sex Pistols happened in London, they radiated out to, a lot more people. And also you had the tabloid press to sensationalise it. So the Sex Pistols became such a sort of cultural event. The Clean became a cultural event in this country, but much lesser so in the sense of there were no headlines, there was no cultural, there was no fear mongering, there was no craziness around them, like there was with the.
So was it the Enemy, the band The Enemy? Was that the one who really kind of started it all?
Yes. That was Chris Knox and Alec Bathgate, Mike Dooley, and who's the bass player? Yeah, fella Dawson.
Right.
They were ground zero. So that story's told in the book. The Clean and the Dreamlife. You Need a Rubber Soul. All that stuff is told because it's the first time I really found out from the participants how it had worked. And that part of the book, the early chapters, really thrilled me because I thought I kind of knew the story, but I didn't. I didn't know the details, and the details are great. There's so many incidents, so many failures, and so many. The Enemy were pretty instantly good. The Clean were not. So there's a lovely contrast of because Chris Knox had absorbed the music, and he was a really great front person. He could take it on. He was the biggest personality, and he could command a hall, which is where they all played in halls initially because they couldn't get into pubs.
Yes.
He could command the stage, and he did, and he was, well, Martin Phillipps from the Chills. The first time he saw Chris Knox on stage, he thought, if that guy comes near me, I'm out the back door. He just looks scary. So Knox had been auditioning all his life for the stage, and when he finally got there, he was sensational. He really was.
Right. And did they support? Did then the Clean go on tour with the Enemy? Was that did they go in the transit van?
They did. Yes, they went, but they didn't really they didn't go on tour, but they did play a gig. They played some gigs in Christchurch in mid-1978. And the Enemy went down really well. The Clean had a bit of a disaster. Their first away performance was not good. They claimed that the Enemy drugged them and they got drunk or something. And it wasn't great. It was not a great performance. Anyway, but the Enemy always supported the Clean. Chris and Alec Bathgate were really their first sort of boosters, and that was really important because after the Kilgours played their first gig, they went, "Oh my God, that was a disaster." Well, Chris and Alex said, no, that was fantastic. They recognised something in them, even though it was shambolic. They recognised something, and it's fascinating. Actually, I've actually heard that tape, David, the first performance by the Clean, 6 minutes 43 seconds, whatever it is, and the riff there for "I'm in Love with These Times," which would become a bit of Roger Shepherd used that song title for his book that he wrote about his time as the boss of Flying Nun, and that it was there in their very first public performance. It was hard. It wasn't easy to distinguish it because they didn't play it as well as they would play it. But they from the outset they wrote great songs. They had great songs, and that's what Alec and Chris recognised that.
Right.
They got talent. There's something or what did Chris call it? He called it weird R&B. Because of course they were Stones freaks, so that would make perfect sense.
Yes, and then did Martin Phillipps appear on the scene at this time as well?
He did. Martin was looking to escape the 9-to-5 life from the time he was a teenager. He'd worked in a flower shop and had various jobs and thought, man, oh man, this is dullness personified. So he had this, wonderful musical ability, and he would sit in as early as 1978. I think he's sitting in on Clean practices.
Right.
Certainly 79, maybe not 78, but 79. He's in the room while they're practicing, and he's absorbing it. And you can hear the sound of the Clean in those early Chills singles like Pink Frost. The guitar sound that's pure Clean's guitar sound,
Right. Yeah.
I'm not saying Martin was inspired by the Clean. Martin from the outset had his own idea of how he wanted to sound, and he would be, a very distinctive, wonderful songwriter in his own right. He certainly had his own vision from the outset, but he was in there, yes, and he toured with the Clean as their sound man. His sole instruction was to make sure David Kilgour's guitar was turned right up, because every time they went to a pub, the pub managers would all get it turned down because David had quite a high sound, a very high trebly sound. So, and this didn't necessarily wash with a lot of pubs, but Martin's job was to make sure it wasn't turned down. But they were a phenomenal live band from 1981. Just phenomenal, David. Oh, my God. And I've heard one of the joys of writing the book on the Clean was I got access to a lot of live tapes that I'd never heard.
Right. God, that must be lovely.
It was amazing because you could actually hear their development from the performance, their debut in May 78, to a performance they gave in April 1979, which was at a local high school, Martin Phillipps' high school. He organised the gig. And they had, by that time, and within that 12 months, or it's 11 months, they had written their anthems. Anything Could Happen, Point That Thing Somewhere Else, And so many of their early great songs they had written. David's 17, Hamish's 2021. They've written them, so it's phenomenal to listen to that and hear the development. And then they made another leap in 1980 when Robert Scott, the bass player, joined. He came from a really a very musical family, strong sense of melody, and he had actually gone to a Clean gig and went, wow, these people are amazing. There's a lot of noise
Yes.
there, but I hear the magic under the noise. He was an art student, and he met David through David's girlfriend, Genevieve, who's
Right.
features in the book. So that tight community, you're so right about, that community was enormously important. David's girlfriend, that was the link to Robert, who had a bass. David Kilgour and Robert were both at art school, and David had seen him, but I don't know if he knew he'd played music. When he went to visit his girlfriend, Bob, who's known as Bob,
Yeah.
was in his bedroom on the bass. And David obviously carried his guitar with him wherever he went at this point. He's writing songs. And they jammed. They jammed that night. And David had just written the guitar line to another anthemic Clean song at the bottom, an instrumental. And so David played the guitar line. Bob went, well, that just needs this, and played on the bass what it needed. And there is the formation of a band that would last 30 odd years.
Blimey, that's amazing. Because another
Oh
band,
no, it's so many great stories, David. That's what I mean. I thought I knew the story, but no, I didn't.
because there's
It's
another
great.
band that appears, Toy Love, as well.
We love that. Yes, that's
Were they an important band on the scene at this time?
enormously. But so that's Chris and Alec progressing out of the Enemy into Toy Love, and Mike Dooley too,
Right.
the drummer, and they picked up Paul Keane of the latterly of the Bats. So that was their four, So these are again pivotal figures, and they formed the band Toy Love, and they went up and down the country, New Zealand. They went to Australia, unfortunately, and they didn't. It was probably the wrong place for them to go. They should have gone to the UK. I think they were more in simpatico with what was happening in Britain than
Right.
Australia.
Yes.
But that's very difficult, that's the money. Isolation did prevent a lot of things happening. Like for me, the Clean, if they'd played in London in 1981, they would have made a name for themselves. I've no doubt about that. They were just so good, original. They would have fitted in, and they would have made a name for themselves. But isolation meant you kind of were inhibited. As an indie band, the idea of going to England was, it was beyond your financial reach, really.
Yes.
Chills did it eventually in '85, but that's 4 years. This is 4 years on, and a lot of feedback had come in. The British press had reviewed a lot of Flying Nun records, and that gave the idea. Actually, it's feasible to go to England and play and maybe make I use the term career sort of lightly, but the Clean never would have gone and lived somewhere else to make a career. They were always going to stay in New Zealand. That was just their attitude.
Yeah. Because it was quite weird. Because I know that in the UK, London, I suppose, in the 80s, there was quite a lot of other Australian bands. I know the Triffids and the Go-Betweens,
Yeah,
and then obviously the Chills all sort of came and had squats in London in
yeah,
various places and became part of a scene. So, I mean, it's kind of
yeah.
interesting. A lot of people have
Well,
got
the Clean would have
stories.
fitted in there. They would have fitted in there. I mean, when Grant McLennan from the Go-Betweens heard the Clean, he got it. He immediately liked them. He understood where they were coming from. The Velvet Underground thing was there, and they were inspired. The Go-Betweens and the Clean were inspired by a lot of the same music. They would take different parts of it, but the Modern Lovers and the Velvet Underground were enormously influential for the Clean, and they were for the Go-Betweens as well. If you think about Robert Forster's initial songs, they're
Yes.
very naive, and that's the very Jonathan Richman template of naivety, But the Clean would take more the beat of, say, something like Roadrunner by the Modern Lovers, and that would be how it would influence them. I mean, Hamish Kilgour tells the story about the first time he heard the Modern Lovers record. He could name the day, and the time probably, because it lodged in his mind as something that was inspiring to him. And the
Yes.
Velvets were always there. I mean, they came out in different ways in the Go-Betweens, probably in their more sort of light, thoughtful songs. Whereas the Clean got into the drone and Sterling Morrison's guitar sound. But they were influenced by it. It's a very interesting thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a lot of not personnel change, but sort of trying to find the lineup for the Clean, wasn't it? They seemed to be constantly
Yeah.
shuffling around, which was quite unusual as well for a band.
Well, yes. Well, this is just the initial period, though, David. When they're trying to find their feet, 78 to 79. So by April 79, there was Hamish and David and the bass player Peter Gutteridge.
Yes.
So Peter would go on to be again a huge figure in the Dunedin scene, forming Snapper, solo, having a solo career. He was a wonderful musician, but at that point he wasn't practicing hard. The Kilgours were obsessed with practicing and getting good, and Peter was a bit of a slacker. Because he had natural ability and he'd always got by in life on his natural ability. So they sacked him. This is their great mate, he's a real fellow traveller. But no, the Kilgours, you're not practicing hard enough, Peter, you're out. And they kicked him out of the band. Peter went home and cried his eyes out, He always remained mates with and admirers of the Clean, and always played with them, actually, right till the end, more or less. But, they were driven. So they sacked Peter. And then they thought, oh, I know what, let's go to Auckland without a bass player. It was kind of nuts. The first time they tried to get to Auckland, the car broke down in Christchurch and they had a kind of had an existential meltdown, as David described it. They tried again. They got they had a new drummer by then, Lindsay Hook. He had a car, which was helpful. And anyway, they got to Auckland and they still didn't have a bass player. And they tried out half a dozen bass players, and some of them were good, really good, but it never quite gelled into a permanent thing. And Auckland was really violent and full of skinheads and boot boys, and gigs were, they actually played some really good gigs. Because one of the amazing things about the book is all the first-person letters and diary entries. And David writes to his girlfriend back in Dunedin when they're in Auckland, describing, they've just finished a gig, and he's writing, we've played to 600 at the Glue Pot Tavern, and which is a music venue at the time, and it's gone really well. But then they would lose the bass player. One of them went to Australia, or just didn't work out. So they had this period of real uncertainty. But then David actually got so annoyed with the whole scene in Auckland, how, just the living conditions, which were bad. He was running out of money. He was sick of the whole violence. And so he packed up his gear without telling Hamish and went home to Dunedin. And so this is a moment of real crisis in their story. And, they didn't know if they would be the Clean again at that point. Because Hamish stayed in Auckland with the band. He played in a little sort of band called the Sobs for a while. And he was uncertain whether to go overseas. He only had $600. He was thinking about going to England, which wouldn't have been a good idea with $600 at that point. Anyway, he ended up. So that's when. So in early 1980, that's when David stumbled upon Bob in playing his bass in the flat, and that's when he told Hamish, "You should come home now, mate, because I've found the guy who's creative and nutty enough to play with us." And so then you see they're settled. That's the lineup for the next 30 years.
Yes.
That would make 5 albums and tour around the world, tour, the UK, play in London, go to Germany. That's the lineup. So yes, you're right. They had this period where it was nuts. It's great to read about. It's just fascinating, and because as you know, the early part of anyone trying to be successful, and their failures are always more interesting. It's like David Bowie. The part of his musical career I love reading about is him trying out all those. He's a mod band. He's a hippie. There's about 5 attempts to be David Bowie before he becomes David
Well,
Bowie, and
yes, his 60s period was bizarre. It was
yeah,
like R&B.
all over the shop.
Yeah, it's kind of very boring. And then the folk stuff as well with Hermione.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of a bizarre one, really. And
But
then he
that's but
obviously,
that's I think that's that you learn about the character in those moments. The success that once you're successful, you learn less about people. You learn something, but I think that early period of Bowie, you really understand the guy's drive to make it.
oh,
And
yes.
and the same with the Clean too. Obviously they're not looking for superstardom like Bowie, but they had that same level of belief and ambition that we can get to where we need to get to. We've just got to apply ourselves, and circumstances will become favourable at some point because we're so committed, and this is what we're going to do, and that's what happened.
Yes. So then when did Roger and Flying Nun Records appear on the scene? Was that because he had seen them perform and think we've got to put this out?
Yeah. Yeah, he'd actually seen the Clean. Roger had come to Dunedin he was in Christchurch. He'd travelled down to Dunedin to see the Enemy
Mm.
because obviously word had travelled up in music circles. You should see this band there, quite something. So he did, and the Clean played support to the Enemy. So he saw that first, maybe that was the second shambolic kind of performance, but recognised, he must have lodged something in his memory cells because by the time the Clean played in April 1981 in the Gladstone Hotel, where they would play 12 gigs a year, the first of those gigs, Roger was there, and he saw them, and he
Right.
told another character in the book, David Swift, "I'm going to start a record label because of these guys." And David Swift, being a journalist, cunningly said, "Okay, I want the first story when you do," and he did. David Swift wrote the first story about Flying Nun in the Christchurch morning newspaper, The Press, and soon after that, soon after Roger got going, and then they recorded. That's when the Clean came. They were on tour. They went to Auckland for a while. And when they came back through the country and stopped in Christchurch, that's when they recorded their first single, Tally Ho.
Tally
That was
ho.
in July 1981. So
Mm.
April, Roger had seen them. By July, they were recording the first record for Flying Nun Records. So you can see. And Roger pursued them to Auckland. He knocked on the door of where they were staying, and the door was answered by Martin Phillipps.
Right.
And because Roger at this point was slightly worried that Ripper or Propeller would sign the Clean from under his nose.
Yes.
So that's how. I mean, people didn't fly. People didn't have the money to just get on a plane in New Zealand in 1981. This cost a lot. So that shows you how motivated Roger was by them. That by what he did. He registered the company, Flying Nun. Then he goes to Auckland in case someone else nicks the Clean, because he knew he's got great ears, Roger. He knew the Clean was something special.
Yes, and that's a sort of an amazing time actually. For me, there was the punk, post-punk, and then sort of the 80s develop in this country. We have, the first bands like, I suppose there was U2, Julian Cope, Big Country, and then 83, the Smiths come along, and there's this kind of sudden independent music scene. And also politically, there was a lot to fight against, as you mentioned, in New Zealand. We had Thatcher, and we'd had the
Poll
Falkland War.
tax.
Yes, that was coming, but we'd had the Falkland War, the miners' crisis,
Yeah.
Greenham Common. So there was this kind of lefty world of indie pop and a huge amount of unemployment. So a lot of people in this country were just unemployed and claiming social security, which kind of helped subsidize such a creative time, I think, in this.
It did. Well, the Clean were on the dole. There's a great. So the first time the Clean really, to me, well, they made a video for Tally Ho. Chris Knox made it, and it's sort of a famous sort of landmark as the first indie rock video on telly. It was different from anything else, way different, way more arty, way more thoughtful. And then the Clean made a more conventional one for the song Anything Could Happen, was made by TVNZ, actually by the state for nothing, amazing.
Right.
But yeah, the state's cultured a lot of that music explosion, recording bands, videos, etc. Anyway, my point is, which I've forgotten now, but oh yes, well yeah. So during the filming of the video, for Anything Could Happen, David tells the story of how he had to go and ring the dole office, to make sure he continued to get the dole. I mean, so they were on the dole. There was no money as such, even though they were a huge success as indie rock stars. I use the word stars loosely. There was, you couldn't make a living, not in this country. The audience simply wasn't big enough. And I mean, I think that was true of a lot of indie bands at that time, that they were well known, but not necessarily making a living.
And in the book, there's this kind of the story about them supporting Marky Smith and the Fall, isn't there? So is this
82.
a kind of a pivotal moment for the band at this point? Is this kind of the first time they'd supported a band outside New Zealand?
Well, that's true, actually. Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, I mean, it was the irony, of course, is they had already broken up the first time. They decided that was enough after they had recorded their second EP, Great Sounds Great. They recorded that in early 1982, and then they recorded Getting Older, the single. Fantastic song. And then they said, that's it, we're breaking up. And they broke up, which shocked everybody. We couldn't believe it. But then the Fall came to the country in, was it July? Somewhere in 82. They were in Australia and then they came here. And yes, someone cooked up a plan with Roger Shepherd for them to support the Fall. And of course, once the Clean were offered the Fall gig, they said, oh yeah, we'll play that. And so they immediately they sort of reformed, I guess, and played that Fall gig. And Marky Smith saw them and thought they were pretty damn good.
Yes.
So, it wasn't really pivotal because they'd already decided they were going to finish. But it would have been nice for them. It would have been good, gratifying for them to have been, earned the kudos of Marky Smith, who didn't exactly hand out bouquets left, right, and centre, did he? So
I wouldn't have thought so. He wasn't.
No, he was impressed with David's guitar style. He said, and he thought he had a voice like Alex Chilton from Big Star. Well, Big Star, I know, were an influence on all indie rock bands to some degree in the 1980s.
Yes,
they were huge.
So then the band, after that, do they split up? Because then there's this bit in 85 where Hamish goes with Roger to the USA, UK and Europe.
Yeah.
So what was the reason for that?
What Hamish going travelling?
Travelled with Roger. He's in the book, on a flying nun business trip.
That was because Flying Nun was it was so expensive to send records from New Zealand to Europe, where there was a growing audience because they were earning reviews in the underground press and in the US, Forced Exposure, and in the UK, the NME and Melody Maker and Sound were starting to write complimentary reviews and pieces about these Flying Nun bands. So it finally dawned that maybe it would be a good idea to start getting the records pressed in Europe. And that's on that trip, probably they secured a deal with Normal Records of Germany and also Creation. Maybe that came later, the Creation label linked with Flying Nun when Creation released Kaleidoscope World, the first Chills compilation. So that's why they went overseas at that point. And that was quite instructive, that period too, for Hamish, who, because New Zealand was very much looked towards Britain as a cultural kind of centre, and New York too, of course. And that was kind of where you went to have a career. But I think Hamish on that trip, and he describes it in his journal that he didn't feel at home in Britain, in the UK at all. It made him realise that he was a New Zealander. And so, and that's a coming of age thing that happens to a lot of us when we go to London. We realise we're not British. We are New Zealanders. We are Pākehā New Zealanders who share this country with the Māori, tangata whenua, and that feeling grew in all of us through the 80s. My generation, certainly, it probably existed in earlier generations. Really fascinating, the history, David, of this country. I read a book recently about a very early colonial farmer, and he could speak fluent te reo Māori because all his workers were Māori and they didn't speak English.
Right.
But he could also sing Land of Hope and Glory. So you've got these two competing cultures, ideas in your head, and before it takes 100 years or whatever for us to become New Zealanders, which is, we recognise this country now as New Zealand / Aotearoa, which is the Māori name for it, the land of the long white cloud, and that's used a lot now. A lot of te reo Māori is used now in our language, and it's a great thing because that's who we are. We're a South Pacific nation. We're in Polynesia. We're not in Europe.
No, absolutely.
And Hamish picked up on that early, and so did a lot of artists and creative people.
Yes.
Poets, etc.
Absolutely. And then sort of as the 80s trundles by, then 88, the band reform. So is everybody excited by this? Is this kind of good news?
Well, it was strange because they reformed in London due to a set of circumstances. Robert was touring with the Bats, Hamish was in New York with Belter Space, and David was on holiday with Genevieve, his girlfriend. So suddenly they're all within proximity, and another important figure in the book, Craig Taylor, who would become the Chills manager, had the idea, why don't you guys play a gig in London? You're just across New York, Hamish. So that happened. So they played at the Fulham Greyhound. I think that's the pub, yeah. And they realised I think they might have had one practice, and they realised, wow, the magic's still there, and people responded. And so I think now they were basically invited back. Craig Taylor said, why don't you do a full tour, next year or whenever? And they said, yeah, only on the basis that we write new songs. We're not going to play our hits. And that's what happened. In 1989, they wrote Vehicle in a matter of 10 days. I mean, they had it. I remember David telling me at one point they'd written 17 songs within a very short period. I think in the book he says 10, but there were more, I'm sure of it. And anyway, so they got to David's house, Robert, Hamish, David, and they just wrote Vehicle so quickly. And then they recorded it. And then Jeff Travis from Rough Trade went to their London. Well, he saw them in 88 and was impressed. He saw them again in 89 and said, we should make a record. And so the Clean recorded Vehicle, their first album as such, because they'd only made 2 EPs. Well, they'd made the groundbreaking 2 EPs and 2 singles. This was their first album, and it was for Rough Trade, which was kind of neat because I always thought they should have had an international audience.
Yes.
They were our secret and we loved it, but I always thought from the outset they should have an international audience. And that record, Vehicle, was, David Kilgour says, was important in breaking them in the States and in Europe as well.
It's a nice bit in the book where David mentions when he's in London, he goes to see Public Enemy, but then he goes to see Prince on the Love Sexy tour with Sheila E. Which actually I went to that at Wembley Arena, and then he mentions all the other bands that you would expect from that time as well, which was quite nice. So you got Genevieve. Who's Lisa? Is Lisa another?
Lisa is yes. Lisa Seagal is Hamish's second wife, and they met in 1988 when Belter Space played for the first time in New York. So
Right,
Belter Space was the band that had come out of the Gordons, who were another astonishingly important, astonishingly loud and great band early on in the Dunedin, in the Christchurch scene. Flying Nun distributed their first EP called Future Shot, which is, hailed by everybody from Thurston Moore to, to your punters and who saw them at the Gladstone when they sort of blasted you against the back of the wall. Just the
right.
sonic power of the Gordon was something else. So they quietened down a little bit, but still had that amazing power and became Belter Space. And Hamish drummed for them for a while in that period where the Clean did not function as such. Although Hamish and David still made music together in the Great Unwashed, and so that period from '83 to '88 is fascinating, and I've got a whole chapter in the book because again, it's that period where they're uncertain about what's going to happen. So it's interesting, again, you see
Yes.
the drive to do and be something. It's just it's more diffuse, but they've still got this aim to make music always.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And Vehicle was the studio album that was
Yeah,
recorded in London for Rough Trade
yeah,
and Jeff
yeah,
Travis. But then
yeah,
they tour America. Do they also tour Europe as well at that stage?
yeah, yeah. They toured. Well, they toured. They played in the East Coast, New York, Boston, before they had recorded Vehicle, and then they played there after they had recorded Vehicle. Well, that's at Europe. I think it's a confusing period, that one, but I know they certainly recorded Vehicle at the end of one tour, and then they went back to Europe and the UK and played again to promote it. Don't
Right.
know. Yeah, and they went to Germany. They played all over, and they really had a great time, and you got crowds, and they noted the difference that particularly German audiences they were the Clean were kind of unnerved because in New Zealand they tended to play pubs. People would be boozing and talking, and so the music people loved the music, but they weren't necessarily there utterly concentrating on the music. Whereas when they went to Germany, they found that the audience was really respectfully listening, would clap, and then there'd be silence while they waited for the next song. And the Clean weren't used to this. They were used to New Zealand people partying, making a noise, and then the next song would start up by the Clean and we'd be a bit quieter. But the Germans, and David Kilgour makes this point, the Germans, the Americans, the English actually really listened.
Yes. And also when they got to Britain, I guess they made a bit of a homage up to Scotland for their homeland.
Yeah, Hamish did. Hamish went up to Scotland because the Scottish blood in the Kilgour family line, also Irish blood, more
Right.
Irish than Scottish. But yes, Hamish went up there, and he saw, who did he see? He saw Jowl Head play.
Oh, yes, for Swell
Uh,
Maps.
yeah, but I think he was. I don't know if it was Swell Matt. Anyway, was it television? Did he play with television personalities at one point? Anyway, Hamish saw him. Actually, Hamish was worried at that point that touring was going to make them a bit dull. I mean, they had this thing that you always had to be fresh. You always had to be writing new material. You didn't sit on your haunches. You didn't sit on your laurels at all. You didn't rest on your laurels. And I remember he wrote a letter to David saying, maybe we're becoming a bit boring by just playing these songs all the time. Maybe we need to think about mixing things up. He was always like that. He was
Yes.
always worrying, that they weren't fresh and they weren't being creative enough, but unnecessarily so. Really, they went from Vehicle and then they made Modern Rock, which was a very different record. A Vehicle was a straight ahead pop noise record, really great, just great. 29 minutes. I think it's all over after 29 minutes. It's just fabulous. Great pop rock record. And then they made And that was made in a hurry at the end of a tour. It was made in 4 days. That vehicle, fast.
Right.
So when they came to make the next record, they wanted to be more relaxed and have more layers to it. And that's what they did, again, always trying to make something new and different.
Yes, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because that came out in '94, and sort of there'd been quite a lot of musical shifts at that. We'd had, like the 4AD bands like the Pixies and Throwing Muses, then the Seattle grunge scene, and then you had
Yeah.
the bands coming out of that kind of world, which was sort of a bit hit and miss from, Soundgarden to Pearl Jam, and obviously you have Kurt
Yeah.
Cobain. So how were they? So they liked modern rock, though, wouldn't they? They were pleased with that particular release.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, it's a terrific record. Modern rock. It really is. One of those records that's probably going to get recognised more and more as time goes on. It was just a very inventive pop record made in the rural setting of the Otago Peninsula, which is a beautiful part of the landscape near Dunedin. It's beautiful, inlets and the Pacific Sea beating against headlands. It's a very inspiring part of the landscape. It was inspired painters and poets, and Martin Phillipps recorded his video for Pink Frost out on the
Right.
peninsula, and the Clean went there in this early '94, I think, and settled into a hall at a place called Hooper's Inlet, and they recorded their record over 10 or so days in a hall, and really took their time with it, enjoyed themselves. They went floundering at night, and they had a fire in the hall,
Right.
so it was an entirely different experience from making a record at, I think it was Blackwing Studios, a deconsecrated church in London. I mean, they enjoyed that experience, but it was a very urban experience, whereas modern rock was made in this rural, peaceful setting, in the shadow of this gorgeous mountain, harbour cone, very conical hill shape. It's lovely. So it was an entirely different experience, but
Yes.
it produced a really lovely record.
So when Unknown Country, which is
Yeah.
the next album, is
Mm.
Genevieve still on the scene at this stage, or because
Yeah, yeah,
she's still with David?
yeah. She's still with David today.
Right. Oh, good.
Yeah,
She's
yeah.
not. I couldn't see so many bits about her in the book actually at this stage. I was thinking, oh God, does that mean they broke up? But it's not. That's good.
No, well, no, well, she was in the book a lot early on because David's writing letters to her. So, and she's also really good at explaining in the early days, why she loved the band, why she thought they were good, and also she tells a bit of her own story, which is great. Um, Yeah, and she's the first person who's hearing the vehicle recordings and talking about those. So those parts are really important. But she's right through the book. She's maybe that unknown country period, maybe not so much because that chapter is really about that record, and she was there when that was being made. Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, and Lisa Segal, Hamish's wife. She. Now she was there for modern rock. Gosh, I'm trying to remember whether she was there for Unknown Country. I don't know that she was. Anyway, she was. They were great. The women were really great in the book. They're just such good talkers and have such good insight because they're slightly once removed from the band in the sense that they have a different perspective. And so Lisa, she describes because the brothers, Hamish and David had a, very creative relationship. Obviously, they wrote songs together, but they also had their moments, and of conflict. They're not the Gallagher
Yes.
brothers by any stretch, but they still have their moments. And Lisa describes them having a political discussion in the van and touring America, and they're almost coming to blows about arguing which is better, socialism or anarchy.
Oh God, we love those kind of ones, didn't we? Yes.
Well, yeah, they're thoughtful people, and they're smart, and they've got great ideas, and they're always interesting. So that helped, and the women were the same, So you've got people who can tell a story, who remember good detail, and that made the book a lot of
Yes.
fun to write. A lot of fun to write.
So with Unknown Country, which comes out, this is the last album they do on Flying Nun Records, isn't
Yeah,
it? So
yeah,
that's good. And was the atmosphere with the band still, because I found doing these interviews, most bands have a 5-year narrative. The
right.
12-month honeymoon period, then they get a single. John Peel played it, a John Peel
Yeah,
session. They get, possibly another single, but they get the first album really enthusiastic, transit band around the country. Second album, a bit better, probably bigger van, bigger venues. Things are going kind of well, but the third album is the one where they're wondering where all the money's gone. They're fractious within the band themselves, and no one's particularly enjoying it. And mostly they know that when they're making that album, they just had it. They're gonna
right.
let's do the
No,
album, let's forget it.
no, that was definitely not the case with the Clean, because they were. You see, because they all had careers out music activity careers outside the Clean. So by 95, David has made 2 solo albums. The latter one, Sugar Mouth in 1994, was a fantastic pop rock record. Robert Scott has really established with the Bats. So, and the Bats have made by 95. Well, they've made three albums, and including Couchmaster in 95, pretty much. And Hamish is in by then a band called the Mad Scene. He's living in New
Right.
York with Lisa. So they have all this musical activity going on outside the Clean. Then what they do is they come together for 2 weeks or whatever, write and record an album. And they did Unknown Country very quickly after Modern Rock. It was only like 12 months space, which is fast for them to do another record. And
Yes.
that record, Unknown Country, is probably their most sort of left field, out there record. It's got some great stuff on it. Franz Kafka and the Zoo, sort of absurdist story, lovely atmospheric piece. I mean, so it's got, but it's definitely their most less. It's the least conventional record, but loved for that reason. So they were still creative, David, and I think they were. They got on. They loved making music together. That's just a fact. So they, even when they were having difficulties, they were still always being creative. There was no
Yes.
sitting. So they made Unknown Country, and then it'd be 6 more years until they made their next record, Getaway, or five more years, 2000 sort of. They made
And
that
this was
record.
on Merge Matador Records.
Yes, you see, the merge link came because I guess they realised they had an audience in the USA from the tours they had done there. And Hamish was, by this period, he was living in New York. He lived in New York from 1988 to basically 2016. So he
Right.
lived there, for a long time. So he would come home, they would make a record. So it was so serendipitous, He probably came home in the summer of 95. That's why they made Unknown Country, because he loved the energy that New York gave to his New Zealand visit. So it kind of worked. And then they realised that they had, because of Hamish living there, the Mad Scene signed with Merge. So that Merge relationship was kind of established at that point with the Mad Scene and Hamish. And then David toured with Mac from Merge,
Right.
with Yola Tango in, I think it might have been 1999. Anyway, they toured and they got on. And so eventually the Clean signed to Merge. That was the natural home for them. They would never go to a major, so merge just suited them, and they liked Mac and the people, Laura from merge, and it just worked for them. And because they started to realise there was a bigger audience in the States for them than there was here in New Zealand.
Yes, because
Because
it's an amazing bit in the book, isn't it? Or because they're in New York when 9/11 happens.
yeah, I know. They land there at 9/11, more or less. I think David and Robert had flown in. They go to sleep that night, and the next morning, Hamish is banging on the door, telling them planes, something catastrophic has happened. Planes have hit the towers, and there's a picture in the book of
Yeah,
David and Hamish on the building while the towers are still smoking before they, got collapsed to the ground. And Robert Scott took that photo.
it was kind of weird
Incredible.
because on that page you've got David saying, looking back, I now I realise I got PTSD, and
Yeah,
that wouldn't have
yeah.
helped really, would it, to see
Well,
something quite so
yeah.
dramatic.
Well, he got PTSD from that event. Um,
Right.
they were. I mean, like anyone who sees that level of destruction, and it was mind-blowingly. You know, I remember. I mean, everybody remembers, I'm sure, where they were at that particular moment. I remember I was in Melbourne in a car, um, working as a journalist, and the paper had, I think the headline was "America Under Attack" with the photos of of fire and destruction and buildings collapsing. It was an incredible moment, and they were right there. But one of the good things that came out of it was that they ended up playing a kind of benefit gig and got reviewed in the New York Times very favourably because, they had the gumption to continue the tour and play. And that was a good thing, I think, for them to have done. They'd been traumatised, but I think that they did something positive, and that probably helped in the long run come to
Yes.
terms with that whole period, which left them all shattered in different ways.
Yeah, but Hamish, I was amazed because you said about him being such a New Zealander, but had spent,
Mm,
such a long time in New York, such a contrast
yeah.
of a cultural
Well,
place.
yeah, he was, he was a New Zealander down to his toenails, but he also had this love of American culture, the USA culture, which had come through his love, their mutual love of the blues, rock and roll, avant-garde, the Velvet Underground, Andy
Yes,
Warhol, that whole factory thing. So New York was also, and which is a point I make in the book. One of the Hamish, they're all very strong visual artists, Robert, David, and Hamish. And one of the first paintings Hamish did was of the Velvet Underground 1969 live inset on that double album and he set those Lou Reed, Mo Tucker, Cale, and Sterling Morrison amongst the New York landscape, and that's a painting that's in the near the end of the book and in double page spread because it's important. Hamish painted that when he was 19, so
right.
yes, he was a New Zealander, but New York was there as it's just I don't know. I think he felt like it was his destiny to live there,
It's
that he would
interesting,
go
isn't it?
there because the Velvets were such a massive thing in his mind, and Ginsberg, Kerouac, the whole American mythology art. He loved that stuff. So it kind of was inevitable. And Lisa, his wife, tells the story of how Hamish, when he'd get homesick and he would dream of the farm they had grown up on the
Right.
South Island, of New Zealand. So yes, he did spend the time in New York, but inside him was New Zealandness and his need to stay connected to it. It
Amazing.
wasn't as if he left and lived in New York and never came back. He came back all the time. They made
Yes.
records, toured. So he had the best of both worlds in some respects. Although New York
Well,
was always a hard place for him to make a living. He worked hard as a, painter, handyman, decorating places. He writes home to his mother, when he first moves there, that he's got a job painting someone's apartment up by Central Park. So he kind of lived his dream to be there. You can tell from his letters. I'm living in a loft in Greenwich Village with a woman who's studying T.S. Eliot at university, and so he loved it. He loved it, and he also tells about how he's sort of getting his painting materials off the street, more or less, and painting, and he actually could sell his paintings on the street in New York,
right.
after. And he did. It was quite good for him in terms of money, which is always hard to come by, and if you're an artist in New York.
So after The Getaway, is the next kind of project they do Mr. Pop? Is that the
Yeah,
next kind of work?
yeah.
So what do they, between that, do they just do their solo business and get on with life?
Well, they toured a lot, in the States, because by this point they were popular enough. It was actually financially feasible for them. They could actually earn a living for the first time, a modest one, but at least they could, earn a living and sell records, and they had a profile by then.
Yes.
And so they started recording Mr. Pop. I mean, I should say on Getaway too, that because of the American links they'd established, that members of Yola Tango, Ira Kaplan and Georgia Hubley,
Right.
they played on Getaway. They cameos. So they were huge fans of the Clean from the time they heard compilation in 1988. Just wow, who are these people? And James McNew, the bass player, tells the story of the first time he saw the Clean in New York. He could not believe it. He said it was like seeing the Easter Bunny. These people are real, because, there was no communication or evidence other than the compilation that this band, The Clean, existed, because there's not a lot of media coverage of them at that time. But they established themselves. They could go to New York and play, and, it was worth their while. And they started recording their last record in New York in 2007. And finished it in New Zealand in, I think, 2008, sort of maybe early 2009. It was released in 2009. Mr. Pop, a very different record, probably the most Bowie-ish European record, really. There's a lot of keyboards in it. It's not sort of drenched in guitar, but it's got the gorgeous song in the Dreamlife, You Need a Rubber Soul, one of David's songs on it. It's a really great record. It's got more space than some of the records like Loog, is that the opening track, I think? And it just sounds fantastic. You turn that up, it's just a huge sort of big electronic keyboard kind of song. I love it. It's different, they always were different, and
But there
that's
was
a
a
very
lot more,
different record.
from the book, it seems like there was a lot more tension with the band during that recording.
Yes, and that was the result of Hamish wanting to continue to really jam songs into shape, to go into the studio and start jamming. Whereas by this point, David has written a lot of his solo records, and they're song based, more so than jamming. And he got sick of that method of them going in cold and starting to make a record. He wanted to go in there with at least songs half written, or an idea of what they were going to record. Whereas Hamish had probably a more wild approach and just wanted to jam things into shape. Well, that created tension, and they had their difficulties about their approach to making the records by that point. But they could still make music. It's just that they made it harder on themselves by not sharing the same vision of how to go about it. It was a different approach to it, and that, as Lisa said, Hamish had become more wild with his years in New York, and probably David had become more settled with his years in Dunedin. So,
Right.
so there was that kind of tension. But fortunately, they always had Robert Scott there, who never took sides and would always be the anchor there. Bob's bass playing was so important to the Clean. David and Hamish played 7 Clean songs when we launched the book in Dunedin with a young drummer called Josh, who did a great job just fitting in there and holding the beat. And Robert's bass playing, I was sort of reminded how propulsive he plays. I've actually posted a lot of that performance
Right.
on my Facebook page because the videos are so great. I wanted people to see. It's not the Clean because Hamish is not there because he passed away in 2022, but it is the closest thing you're going to hear to it. And they do 7 songs and they all sound fantastic. It was a real pleasure. I mean, what an honour to have that band, to have those guys reform for one night to play 7 Clean songs for the launch of our book. It's very much our book, the Clean book, because they're communal in all the things they do. They're communal in the way they shared their love with Flying Nun so other bands could record. They've always encouraged other artists, writers, poets. They've always been encouraging and communal, and that's the way the book was done.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then so then after that, there's just a series of gigs and tours and, to finish the book.
Yeah.
Or the last few chapters is them sort of just doing the odd project together, but no more recording. Is that correct?
No. Yeah. Yeah. Well, they did record, they did start to record another album in 2011. I think that's 2011. That's right, because it was just after the Christchurch earthquake. They were Hamish was very shaken up by that. So they tried to get an album going, and I mean, I've heard the recordings, and possibly a lesser band would release them, but no, they're not finished. None of them were happy with what they sound like, even though I quite enjoy hearing them. There's like 10 or so pieces,
Right.
finished to varying degrees, but none wholly finished. So they'd never release it. But even right up into they always had the idea that they might do something again. So I never thought that they would never do anything, because in 2015 they toured Australia. That would turn out to be their last overseas tour. They played again in 2016 at Chick's Hotel in Port Chalmers, and that proved to be their last gig, 2016.
Right.
But and the following year they were inducted into the New Zealand Music Hall of Fame, probably some people thought unwisely, because they'd never paid homage to the industry whatsoever, so they didn't really need its validation. But anyway, they did it, and that was it. But I think David says in the book, and Robert was always open to it, because Robert's just an amazingly productive person. If someone says, can you play a gig, Robert will say, yeah, I can play it. He's just incredible capacity for work and writing songs, and painting pictures, incredible. So, it could have happened. It didn't, because circumstances were kind of against it. But, well, the thing is, they've done their work.
Yes.
Across 30 years, they made these 5 albums and these landmark EPs and singles. So, and they had also created a whole other body of music. Hamish, Robert, and David had created solo records. David's made probably 10, maybe 11 solo records, and he's got a new one coming out next year. It's beautiful. I've heard it. It's fantastic. It's a lovely, lovely record. Robert continues to tour with the Bats. He'll be in Europe later this year with the band in England. And Hamish always played. He would be he when in New Zealand, and I think I just watched a video of him playing in 2018, I think, in Auckland in a basement with a pickup band, and they're fantastic. I can't remember it's on YouTube. It's just a really great piece of groove, kind of Stooges noise, but melodic, and yeah, it's just fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah, so Hamish remained creative right up until, his last days. He had his mental struggles, and he had a sad end. But he was in psychiatric care in his latter months. But in there he was still painting. He was still creating, and his paintings became darker because of where he was at. He had a deterioration physically of his brain, so it was something he couldn't fight really. It was very sad.
God.
So it was a sad end, but I, I think you have to think about what he did across the span of his life, and he was an inspiring New Zealander to a lot of us, to a whole generation of us. The Clean were inspiring. They really were. They made life here different. So they'll always be there. They're not. It's not like, oh, they're finished, they're gone. They will never go from the cultural fabric of the country because they played such an important part in us realizing who we are and where we are.
Yes. And then obviously Peter also passed away, didn't he?
Peter Gutteridge did, yeah. But David and Peter were creative again. See, Peter would come up. They lived in the same area of Dunedin, this valley called Northeast Valley. And Peter would go from his house, walk up to David's of a morning. They might smoke some dope, and then Peter would settle down at the piano and start playing a song, and David would accompany him and record it. And there's some of those recordings, I think, are on Mixcloud, of Peter playing these, 10-minute piano pieces, and they're beautiful because he reduced his music to a kind of single note hum. He believed that music was a kind of force to reach out into the universe, and that it was healing. He had very interesting ideas, Peter, about the power of music and drone, and he would have drones running in his house 24 hours a day. He was a very interesting, eccentric character, and he had his psychiatric struggles as well, and but he had that creative side that he was unique in his outlook, and he knew the history of music, and he knew the history of the drone. He loved the way it went back to Arabic times, to the Middle East. He was he was a smart guy, and he loved the whole way, that music connected people across centuries, and that same sound, the drone, the bagpipes, whatever, they played similar instruments in the Middle East. That drone, that to him was a life-giving, a healthy human force.
Yes, amazing. Well, look, this is, and the book. I mean, by the way, how long did it take to pull it all together? Because it is an amazing piece of work.
Thank you. Well, it is an amazing piece of work, and that's because of the photographers and the band themselves, their ability to express what they were feeling, what they're doing, to talk about their music in a broad context. It was sort of 3 years of from starting to finishing, but it was a pretty 18 months was intense, and 3 months was for 3 months I worked full time on the book. I took time off from my day job as a television director and just spent 3 months really working, getting the backbone of the book together. So that was really important. At one winter, I sat in this room and really between, would be on the phone to David, emailing with Robert, and all the other people who are in the book, just checking, rechecking. We really got the book sorted in that period. And but the thing is, David kept discovering letters, diaries, right up until the deadline of the book, really.
Right.
Yeah, and Robert only found that photo, that 9/11 photo, like 2 weeks before we were due to go to print. So
Blimey.
it was really advantageous that I did it as an oral history because it
Yes.
allowed me to slot things in. I didn't have to recast a whole page or a chapter. All I did was, I could slot it in pretty much like a digital documentary. If you suddenly want to shift a scene or add a scene, you can do it in
Yes,
digital,
it's quite handy,
when
isn't
you're
it?
working. And so if I'd written it as me synthesizing everybody and writing the whole book, which I would never have done anyway. But it would have been a disaster. I would have had to unpick every chapter all the time because there was so much new, vital stuff David was finding. He found Hamish's diary from 1977, very
Right.
late in the piece. And this is where Hamish is, he describes, and this is the stuff I love. He describes going around Dunedin's record shops, buying the Velvet Underground, buying this, listening to it, hearing it for the first time. He describes cutting his hair short after he sees Lou Reed in Dunedin in the mid-70s. So you're actually there with them while their stories, unrolling across time. It's in real time, so that's the benefit of all the letters and the diary entries, and that's what makes it vital. You're with them. You're with them on the ride of their entire lifetime. And I always thought it was this book's come a bit late. We should have written it earlier. But actually, I realised looking back across time adds a kind of richness and a perspective that you don't get if you don't
Yes,
wait. And I think the
no.
book's a way stronger piece of work for that time of being able to look back. I mean, David and Bob's memories of of things that happened 30 years ago is vivid. They might get dates wrong, but I could sort out dates through what they were talking about, or you go online, you can find there's a whole thing called set lists, and it's got
Oh,
every
yes.
gig bands play. It's very helpful in making sure the timeline's right. And I was also lucky in that Craig Robertson, another fellow Dunedin writer who's a university professor now in the USA, wrote a book on Chris Knox. And that's a great book. And it was really, really helpful in me getting my story, the clean story straight, because Craig is a scrupulous researcher, and he wrote, the biography of Chris Knox, Not Given Lightly, also put out by Auckland University Press in New Zealand. And that was really, really helpful because he shared his research with me so that we got the dates right, because memory is very, very elusive.
Yes, this is
So that was
true.
very helpful.
Amazing.
It was fun to know that Craig was also working away across similar territory, but doing it from a different perspective.
Yes. God. I mean, it's great actually having so much. I mean, that's the one thing, because when I first started doing this show in about 2017, 18, there wasn't that much interest in indie pop from whatever you want to call it, from the 80s.
Yeah.
There really was not much. People were like, oh,
Right. Really?
the musicians had generally not thought about it because they had moved on from that period. Most, not all, but a lot had. And there just wasn't that much seen. But then it literally has been in the last 10 or 6 to 8 years, I'd say. It's suddenly, books are
Yes.
coming out. Everybody's writing their memoir, but there was no memoir of that period before.
Yeah.
There's been exhibition films, documentaries.
Yeah.
It's suddenly, but it's, I suppose, that generation are now thinking, I want to archive it. So, and I want to tell my story because it hasn't been told. History has been told by, a few people who are mainstream. And suddenly everybody's saying, no, wait a minute, there's this scene and that scene. So you'd have seen so many books coming out on very, very obscure bands that you think, well, that's brilliant. But
yeah, they're all got, most of them have got great stories. I've got Luke Haynes's book, and that period is.
Oh, is that the one, the Luke Haynes, which is the Britpop one?
Yeah, Freaks Out, it's called.
Oh, Freaks Out. Yeah, I love that one. There was the one
Luke
before that
Haynes.
where he talks about Britpop as well, which I've
Right.
just I have been
Yeah.
just delving into because he's so funny. But yes, Luke.
But I think it's inevitable, David, that every generation looks back. I'm 66 now, so I'm looking back. And I think that's inevitable. My mother was an English nurse. She came to New Zealand, continued nursing. And she would read books on the Second World War because that was when she was
Yes.
growing up, and my father would read books on shipping because he was a sailor when he was in his late teens, early 20s. So we inevitably look back on the period that forms us
Yeah.
and it's our 20s and 30s, and so we look back on that, and that's why I think you get a rash of books, and the really good thing is, the literary people have got an appetite to read many different stories from people they vaguely know or bands they know, like Felt and Lawrence's story. I mean, all
Oh,
that
yes.
stuff. The people who get to, television personalities, all those bands that kind of were really important and formative to us and we know of, but were kind of, probably underground and not really known by the wider culture. They're really important to us because they're the things that shaped us. So
Yes,
for me to
absolutely.
have the chance to write a book on the clean was kind of just incredible privilege. And I mean that because they were my favourite band by a country mile, I just love them. Seeing them live was just wow. It took your eyes out, took your ears out. It was just phenomenal, and they were never ordinary. That's the other thing about them. I think I only saw them once when they were less than marvelous, and that's because they'd played a gig on the Saturday night that was just levitatingly good. The Monday night they weren't so great. Well, that I was used to them, the level they were at. Anyway, so it was a real thing. It was just I was just so grateful to have the chance to tell the story when David said, yeah, you should write the book on it. And
Let's do
away
it.
we went. Yeah, we did it. And I mean, it was seriously a communal effort, man. The photos, because it always attracted creative people, photographers, writers, and so forth. And that's why the book looks great. And they're great artists. I mean, Hamish doodles a song list in 1982 when they're supporting a band called the Screaming Mimes. And it's artful, it's
Yes.
cross-hatched, it's drawn, it's just, and you've got to put that in a book because it just looks fantastic. And that, he's not trying to do anything, he's just made something beautiful. A song list, writing the song list. I mean, who does that? But, well, Hamish did, because he was fascinated with art. He knew the history of it. He knew the periods of it he loved. So these are creative people in the broadest sense. They just
Yeah.
happen to choose music.
Amazing. Well, look, Richard, thank you ever so much for this. This has been amazing. If you want, I can always send you the link and then you could use it elsewhere. But yes, I will
Thank
definitely.
you. I appreciate that.
No, God, it's been fantastic. And I have to say,
I hope so. I do go on.
no, it's fine. It's fine. I'm just also getting a bit tired, actually.
Yeah, no, fair dues. It's 11 o'clock at your place, sort of nearly.
Yeah, nearly 12.
So thanks for doing that,
Yes,
David.
well, look, I'll be in touch. But again, thanks for replying and fixing this.
Oh,
This
yeah,
has been
sure.
amazing. But look, I'll let you go.
Yeah,
But
no,
thanks
yeah.
again.
So when do you think you'll get it up by?
I'll do it next week because otherwise I'll miss
Next
it.
week.
I'll do it.
Yeah, and you're on Blue Sky too, aren't you?
Blue Sky. Yes,
You
I
know,
am. Yes.
the alternative,
The
the nicer
alternative.
version of Twitter,
Oh God, yeah. I know. I get
which wouldn't be hard.
no.
It's a cesspit now. Even I had to get off that.
Oh, I know. Well, I did. Yeah. Anyway, it is a cesspit of just weakness.
Oh, it's horrible.
I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, it's made it easy to get off it. I have to say.
Oh yeah. No, it's just so full of lies. It's just unconscionable now.
It's weird. It's just a bizarre place. Anyway, look, I'll let you
Yeah.
go and have a lovely day.
Great.
Take care. See you
You have a
later.
good sleep. Have a good
Thanks a
sleep,
lot.
David. See you,
Bye-bye.
mate.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that was me in conversation with Richard talking about his new publication titled In the Dreamlife, You Need a Rubber Soul. And basically, it's a book about the clean from New Zealand. Anyway, if you want to contact me, you can on any of the social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show. In the meantime, have a great week. Stay safe.